Welcome everybody to the first Uio Norden webinar initiated by the Nordic Branding Project. My name is Malcolm Langford and I'm a Professor of Law at the University of Oslo and also Project Leader for Nordic Branding, Politics of Exceptionalism. Sweden's response to the Covid-19 pandemic has been discussed around the world. How did the model of strong state welfare paternalism become the poster child for the American right and Fox News with its light and liberal approach to Corona? The focus is now its small state exceptionalism and its potentially exceptional statistics of infection and mortality. But there are different perspectives on this, and we're going to hear from them across the Nordic countries today. We will be, in this webinar, using the webinar version of Zoom, which is a little different from normal Zoom. Only the videos of those presenting and asking questions orally will be shown. Three things before I hand over to Tora Rem. The first is, if you wish to speak and ask a question in the discussion time, put up your virtual hand in the participants function and you'll be promoted to a panelist and you can ask your question. If you wish to ask a written question, you can do so in the Q&A function or in the chat function. And finally, this meeting will be recorded, so if you do ask a question orally, you'll be part of the recording, which will be posted on YouTube after the event. And now, Uio Norden's director, Tora Rem.
Yes, thank you, Malcolm. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you to this webinar on Swedish exceptionalism and more generally on the Nordic responses to the COVID-19 crisis. And I do so as director of Uio Nordic, an interdisciplinary research initiative at the University of Oslo. We support a wide range of events and undertakings, but our main activities are channeled into 10 large research groups, and one of these is Nordic Branding, led by Malcolm Langford, my co-host here today. And I'd also like to mention that we're part of a larger consortium of Nordic universities called Renew. I'll be brief. An overarching goal of Uio Nordic is to generate new knowledge about Nordic characteristics in an international context. And that, I would say, is what we'd like to do today through this webinar. The Nordic countries are often seen as one and the same, and we ourselves often refer to the Nordic model. But these countries are clearly not identical, even if they have family resemblances. And this fact alone invites comparison and may lead to self-reflection and greater awareness of the values and perceptions, the history and political systems that guide and inform our respective societies. And right now, it may seem that the Nordic countries represent something of a small laboratory for different approaches to the threat that is COVID-19. Today, we'll primarily be talking about internal dynamics in the Nordic region, but there is, of course, also the view from outside, from the wider world. And this is what Nordic Branding has set explore. Malcolm touched on this, but just notice how the Nordics have been used as a positive model on the left of American politics, and how Sweden has recently been put to use by the political right as an example of the freedom championed by conservatives worldwide, as Fox News has it. It added recently, even the country's elderly, who have been the biggest victims of the virus, are following along. Meanwhile, British Financial Times reports on Sweden's death toll, on how Sweden's death toll unnerves its Nordic neighbors. Why is Sweden different? How different is it really? Where does Sweden's seemingly different approach to the crisis stem from? These will be some of the questions we'll be asking our panelists, or asking our panelists to respond to during the next hour. But we'll also, towards the end, hope to touch on the consequences of these differences in response and the perceptions of difference and what they may have, among others, for the relationship between our separate national identities and our common Nordic identity. We're really honored to have such distinguished panelists with us. And I'll ask Tori Loven-Kirkebø from Nordic Branding to introduce them briefly.
Thank you, Tore. So my name is Tori Loven-Kirkebø, and I coordinate the project Nordic Branding. And we have a great Nordic panel with us today. From Sweden, we have Professor Bo Rothstein, who holds the August Röst Chair in Political Science at the University of Gothenburg. He has published extensively on the Nordics and is an active contributor to the public debate in Sweden. Last week, he came out strong against the Swedish approach in Göteborgs-Posten, arguing that the corona crisis has distorted the image of Sweden as we know it. From Finland, we have Associate Professor in Nordic Studies at the University of Helsinki, Johan Stang. Professor Stang is a project leader for the research project Norden since the end of history, funded by the Academy of Finland Research Fellowship. Professor Stang wrote a comparison of the Nordic approaches to Corona Nordic-Site-Info in April, which inspired, among other things, this seminar. From Denmark, we have author and managing director with Macro Advisory Partners, Dr. Bo Lidegaard. Dr. Lidegaard is former editor-in-chief of Politiken. He has worked as a diplomat and within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Denmark, and has published extensively on Danish history. And lastly, from Norway, we have Professor Kristin Sandvik from the University of Oslo. She's the project leader of Ripples, which analyzes the role of legal responses in rebuilding and strengthening societal security after violent extremist attacks. But in the last few months, she's also been an important driver and contributor to the Faculty of Law's webinar series on Corona and the rule of law. So welcome very much to everyone. We're looking forward to today's conversation and your contributions.
Thanks very much, Tori. And we're going to start off with a quick round of the four speakers to describe what has been their country's response to Corona so that we can start to compare and understand Sweden's response. And we'll start with Bo Rothstein.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this. Yes, as is well known, the Swedish response have been different when it comes to the lockdown policy and so. However, I belong to those who don't think that these national policies, the stringency of the lockdown, has had so much importance for real behavior or for the outcome of this virus. I mean, if you look at the regional differences in countries like Spain, France, and Italy, they are huge. Also in Sweden, the number of people who have died in Scania is 10 times less than the people in Stockholm. So if the national policies would have had this big influence, we wouldn't have seen those enormous regional differences. However, there are three things where I think Sweden differs a lot from the other Nordic countries. One is that in Sweden, the politicians, the elected politicians, the prime minister and the cabinet has clearly taken the back seat. They have left most of the policy and most of the public discussion to their experts in various expert authorities. Secondly, I do think that there is a difference here that Sweden used to be known as the home for safety, the Volvo cars, security, generous welfare state that took care of you from the cradle to the grave. And the recent 2-3 weeks that have shown that Sweden is actually now, when it comes to the risk of dying from this virus, the most dangerous country in the world. I think this has caused irreparable damage to the Swedish brand. And there may be a third thing also. I'm not so sure how it looks in the other Nordic countries, but there has been huge disagreement among them to this. A very, very tough debate among them. And it's very seldom that you see this in an area like medicine in Sweden.
Thanks very much, Bo. And now for a quick description of the Norwegian situation. Kristin?
So I just thank you for inviting me today. I think, and this is what I've learned from the webinars we hosted over the last 8 weeks, I think there are certain things that characterize Norway, and one is, of course, luck. You know, we had a great deal of luck, and we have the oil fund, which is sort of defining long term. So I think in Norway, there's been a fairly well-balanced division of labor between experts and politicians and the bureaucracy that has worked out. We haven't had any structural problems with municipalities versus the state. It's been fairly well integrated comparatively. And of course, we have an old population, but we have low antibiotics resistance, for example. So we never really were pressured. There's been a lot of collaborative lawmaking going on. In Sweden, you've been talking about folkvett, common sense. In Norway, we've been talking about dugnad, voluntary contributions for the effort of the common good. So there's been collaborative lawmaking, lots of public debate. I've been working a little bit on the right to health information because there was a failure to adequately taking to consideration that Norway is a multicultural country. So it took a bit of time to get information across. But if I can talk about I'd say that Norway didn't let anyone die on account of ethnicity or social class. And I think that's probably, many things haven't gone right, but this is a defining characteristic, I think, of our response.
Thanks, Kristin. Bo, on Denmark?
Yes, let me add my thanks to those of others. Very curious to hear these experiences also from Nordic colleagues. So 3 brief things on the Danish response. We had a very early and very sweeping lockdown starting on the 11th of March, where the contamination was still pretty low, but of course growing fast. Then, from then on, and the next 6 to 8 weeks, we had very close to a full consensus in the country on this very thorough lockdown. We had it strongly led by our Prime Minister and the rest of the government and the leading health officials responsible in the various health institutions. And there was sort of a general mobilization of the entire authority of society, from the Queen to the head of the police, and a very strong backing in the public behind the strategy of the government, which, like in Norway, very expressively also was leave nobody behind. And we sort of, the 2 curves that you have all seen, the red curve, the green curve, and the steep and the less steep rise became knowledge for every child in the country and the talking piece in any family in the country. As we have started since Easter reopening, discussion has begun to emerge, political discrepancies, what to open, when to open, how fast to open, and a growing sense that perhaps there was an overreaction, that maybe we should have been more Swedish and have kept schools open, to take an example, and also a growing recognition of 2 casualties that we have not really seen yet. One in the social dimension, where of course being locked down for an extended period of time is much harder for people living in poorer quarters and more people in smaller places. And also there are huge ramifications from the economy, which of course has suffered big damage. So now the discussion is there and it's growing. And my prediction is that we are in for a pretty rough ride, even if the government is starting from an extremely high level of support in this particular domain.
Thanks very much, Abu, for also a concise description. Johan Strong on Finland.
Yeah, thanks. Well, there is always, of course, the danger of when we compare the Nordic countries that we exaggerate the difference. It's like the famous narcissism of small difference, and this is especially true when we compare ourselves to Sweden, with whom we all have a rather complex relationship and always want to compare ourselves with. So I think that the difference between the countries are perhaps not that dramatic as sometimes is portrayed in media. I mean, from what I hear from Sweden, the tube is almost empty there, and as it is here as well, people who can work from home. And in Helsinki, we have been able to go to shops and go outside, enjoying the days of sunshine, which I think that we all need on these latitudes. So in this sense, perhaps Norden collectively stands out as quite open societies throughout the pandemic. That said, I think that the measures taken in Finland in the initial phases were undoubtedly much stronger than those in Sweden, particularly, and also in comparison to the other Nordic countries, because we were quite delayed in the pandemic. We didn't have any cases, or at least not as many cases as in the other Nordic countries, and still we closed the schools for 2 months. They have just reopened, and the restaurants are not open yet. Travel between the Uusimaa district in southern Finland was restricted for 3 weeks to the rest of the country. And we even opened our emergency stocks of medical supplies and other things, which kind of made Finland famous for some point through in the pandemic. And yes, also in Finland there has been a broad agreement around all of this. Now there is a huge debate about these European financial rescue plans, and this debate has been going on for a week or so, and it's a much more deep debate in Finland, I think, than in the other EU countries, particularly Sweden. There is some debate in Denmark, I know, but in Sweden there is no debate at all. So.
Thanks very much, Johan. So we'll move on to our main question for today. Why? To the extent that there is differences across the Nordics, even if they're narcissistic, what can explain the divergences, particularly what we saw in March and April this year? So we'll start off with Johan.
Yes. Well, I wrote this piece that Tori already mentioned almost 2 months ago, and much has happened since then. But what I tried to do is to understand the different Nordic reactions to the pandemic through some kind of historical, cultural factors. And in this analysis, I think that the Swedish exceptionalism was down to 3 different factors. And the first is the division between East and West Nordic countries when it comes to administrative cultures. So in the East, in Sweden and Finland, we share this idea of a strict division between government and administration. So the health authorities are much more autonomous and act independently of the government. In Denmark and Norway, the authorities stand more directly under government control, and therefore it was easier for Mette Frederiksen and Erna Solberg to overrun the health authorities when it became politically necessary. Stefan Löfven has, as Bo Rothstein mentioned, been largely invisible throughout this crisis. Finland then differs from Sweden in having a more legalistic political culture. Recommendations tend to need to be put down as law in order to have these normative powers. And then we also had an Emergency Powers Act already there, which enabled swift measures. So Sweden stands out in my view as in the Nordic context as a country with a particularly close relationship between autonomous authorities and citizens, which doesn't need to be channeled through the political level, so to speak. Swedes trust Tegnell more than they trust Löfven. And the second point is that the pandemic was right from the start treated as much more a broad challenge in Sweden than in the rest of the region. The social dangers of locking down the society was stressed by Tegnell and his peers, and the impact on the economy was immediately taken up in Swedish media. So in the piece, I tried to make the argument that economic policy has always been key to the Swedish welfare state, and that they always think about like the connection between public health and social and economic factors. And the final point I made was a bit more speculative about the kind of peculiar self-confidence that characterizes Swedish political cultures in comparison to the rest of us. Swedes are somehow used to Sweden being this leader and model. It's världens modernaste land, you know, it's at the absolute vanguard of human development. And from this point of view, it was not a problem that Sweden acted differently than almost every other country in the world. To the contrary, it fed into this narrative of Swedish exceptionality. And it was only a matter of time until the rest of the world would wake up and follow the Swedish lead. In Finland and the other countries, we are not used to taking the lead in the same way. We are small countries, we adapt. That's what we do. Politics about adaptation to other to difficult circumstances. So this was basically my argument in the piece, and there's much empirical research that I would like to do on this, particularly on the role of Nordic cooperation in the initial phases of the pandemic, or the lack of Nordic cooperation then. But that is perhaps something that we can return to later.
Thanks very much, Johan, for a concise overview of three potential causes. Bo Rostein.
Well, I will not disagree with Johan here, but I would like to point out that the situation is quite peculiar and different. If you look at the two other big crises that have happened in Sweden during the last 40 years, when this Soviet submarine with nuclear weapons was stranded in the southern archipelago, in the early 1980s, it was very clear that the then Prime Minister Thorbjörn Fälldin took command, very clear, and that he and his close collaborators in the government took the lead, and they didn't leave this to the generals or admirals. And we can see the same thing in the early 1990s, when we had this huge economic crisis. It was also then the politicians who took the lead, the Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister, and made big bipartisan deals. We then had a government led by the Conservative Party, who went into close collaboration with the Social Democrats. So this situation is quite unique, that we see that it is the heads of the public health authority that have given this enormous, I've never seen this before in Sweden actually, this enormous front seat drive and taking charge of politics. I think also it was a case that many people had faith in them and what they did in the beginning, but now day after day the tabloids are stressing that Sweden leads this sad contest in most people dying out of this disease. And I think this will change quite dramatically, this trust here, because yes, we tried a separate way, but it didn't work. Now, I think what has also come forth is that this is a disaster for the Swedish model of public administration, giving so much power to the regions and to local governments here, who have been responsible for elderly care. I mean, if you think about it, the high number of deceased people in Sweden cannot be due to the lockdown. 80% of those who have died are over 75 years old, and most of them have been in elderly care. They have not been out, given lockdown or not. They wouldn't have gone to bars, hugging strange people all the time. They were isolated from the start. So it's very clear that the virus have been brought to them, and it can only have been people working in elderly care. Now, I don't want to blame them, but the blame is very, I think, clear that this goes to the Swedish Association for Local Authorities and Regions, who did not act. It was very well known already from when the virus started in China that the people who were most dangerous were elderly people and frail people. But there are three things they didn't do. They didn't educate those who took care of elderly people. They didn't give them protective equipment. Instead, they protested when this came on the table that it would cost too much. But I think maybe the worst thing is that, especially in the big cities, they have had many people working in elderly care on a time-based contract. They work hour by hour. And if you do that in Sweden, you do not have a good health insurance or sickness insurance. And that means that for these people, often quite poor people, to stay at home when they had symptoms would have costed them a lot. This was known from the beginning, but they didn't act. And I think this is the main problem here. The lockdown or no lockdown Swedes have not, as was said, behaved very differently from people in other countries. And you can also compare Belgium and the Netherlands. Netherlands had a much more lax lockdown than Belgium, but Belgium has more than twice as many people who have died than has the Netherlands. So it's something else that explains this enormous differences in how many people who have died due to this virus.
Mm. Thanks very much, Bo. And we've got two causal themes going on here. How do we explain, slight differences in the lockdown approaches, and how do we also explain the differences in infection and mortality rates? So, Bo, you want to continue the conversation?
Yes, I would have to agree with my name brother on that there is a confusion between the perception that the initial Swedish approach that was much less restrictive from the regulation point of view, not necessarily from the behavioral point of view, that this much less restrictive approach is directly the cause of the excess mortality in Sweden. And when I have talked to people in Sweden and seen statistics from Sweden, I have ended at exactly the same conclusion as Bo was just explaining. The excess mortality in Sweden is concentrated in some big cities, especially in Stockholm. It is concentrated in elderly nursing homes. And if I can add one dimension which has struck me, who has taken a long-term interest in the development of the welfare models in the various Nordic states, Sweden has gone much further than the other Nordic countries in privatizing primary delivery of welfare to citizens, including nursery homes. And working conditions in nursery homes, privately owned in Sweden, much more relative to the other countries. Working conditions there are exactly, as Bo was explaining, more precarious, incentivizing the staff to actually go to work, even if they're ill. And that is, of course, for this particular pandemic and this particular virus, with its very strong bias towards elderly, that is a fatal nexus. And if you then add that a disproportionate high percentage of those precarious workers in these places are immigrants with little knowledge, or some of them with little knowledge of Swedish, and in the very long time it took for Sweden to actually get the adequate instruction and information translated, and the staff adequately trained and informed about the very simple rules that we have all learned are actually key to keeping mortality down. Very simple, very cheap rules. Physical distance, washing hands, and these things. These factors, much more than the openness, are the cause of Sweden's excess mortality, which leads me to the conclusion that in many ways, Sweden actually is a model because of the much less strict lockdown, keeping schools open, keeping especially the youngest part of the population working and out there, while respecting these simple rules. And this is also why I guess we see, like Johan was also outlining in his first intervention, a realignment of how the Nordic countries are actually behaving. And I think if you look to the Nordic countries today, we have pretty much ended in the same place, starting a different, with a little bit different approaches. But I think the level of lockdown and the level of reopening and the level of how the societies are now functioning again is very similar across the Nordic region. But if and when we get a second wave or the next pandemic, and we are to take experience with us from this round, I think we can learn a lot from Sweden in terms of how little was necessary, but also, of course, the importance of not failing the most vulnerable groups and not repeating the mistakes that were made in the elderly care sector in Sweden, which are pretty well defined, but also in the broader picture, of course, something you can actually address and do something about.
Thanks very much to the two Boos, and we'll now go over to Christine for her perspectives on why Sweden was or is different from the others in terms of its response.
Well, I think I'll just mention, because a lot of things have been said, so I'll just bring up something else, and that's tolerance for casualties, where I think that Norway has a particularly low tolerance for casualties. I mean, it's partly a reflection of nothing else, much else having happened since 1945, that the Second World War is still having such a prominent role in the Norwegian public discourse. I grew up on the coast. My first memory is from March 1980, of things going on in society, where the platform Alexander Kielland turns over and 123 people die. And it really, growing up in Stavanger, that was a shadow for a decade. Our work on the 22nd of July response and law, 77 people died at Utøya, again perceived partly as a result of the government not adequately having protected young people. So I think for us, just trying to prevent almost at any cost people from dying almost has a separate dynamic that I think might be different from the other Nordic countries.
Thanks very much, Christine. And we've now got around 17 minutes or so to have an open discussion on explaining the differences. So you can write your questions in the chat, the Q&A, or raise your hand. But I'll give the first question to Tore Alem.
I'm just wondering whether you could follow up on the last point, really, from there, to hear what the other panelists think about this idea of tolerance for casualties. Does that have to do with also with Norway's quite unique sort of economic position, do you think? That the economy has been more important, say, in Sweden than it is in Norway, or seems to be in Norway?
I'm not too sure that Norway stands out as a particularly intolerant to casualties, or in that sense that nothing has happened since the Second World War. I think that the Second World War is still the main event, certainly in Finland, but also in the other Nordic countries, the last catastrophe. At least, I mean, in Finland and Denmark, we have been marked by a very low tolerance for casualties, and a bit surprised to the way that Swedes have been kind of able to look away from the relatively high number of deaths, and we are a bit surprised about that, and also like if we compare to other catastrophes, and I mean another Swedish catastrophe in recent history is the Estonia, the ship wreck, the ship catastrophe, and that was a major thing which was dealt with in years and years, and which is still kind of digested in Swedish public discussions and where this tolerance for death is really not there. But in this instance, there's something has happened now. This pandemic seems different.
I tend to agree here. Our prime minister, who really sort of took lead and became a rallying point in the country during the crisis, she said very early on that any casualty would be a tragedy. And many, I must say, myself included, felt that for a long time it was as if any death from COVID was exceptional, and it was like society had almost forgotten that people happen to die every day in a society, and that actually death is something that is occurring to approximately 1% of the Danish population every year. And therefore, of course, it took also a long time before we started not to count COVID death, but to count excess mortality, which of course is a very different way of calculating, and I think much more relevant in this particular context. But that was not the approach of the government to start off with. May I perhaps add one thing? I can see a question that has been posted on the chat relating to Greenland, and I could add the Faroe Islands. In Greenland, they only had, if I remember well, one case who was a professional skier who came back from Italy with COVID, was isolated, and it did not spread. In the Faroe Islands, they had actually quite a significant number of infections, but a very effective response with, I think, 100% contact tracing because of the very small social, the small number of the population and the social fabric close enough to basically being able to decipher it. And the Faroe Islands came out of the pandemic without any casualty.
Thanks very much, Bo. I'm going to turn to the other Bo in Sweden and then to Kristin.
I don't think economics have played such a big role in Sweden because the Swedish public finances at the beginning of this crisis and still are in extremely good shape. So it has not been a case that there is no money for helping both the local authorities or the regions who are responsible for healthcare, or companies or small companies who are suffering. About the tolerance, I cannot comment. I would be surprised if the tolerance was bigger in Sweden than in other countries. The main thing in Sweden here is the helplessness of the government. So our Minister of Social Affairs, responsible for healthcare, has promised that we should test much more and that we should have 100,000 tests going on now. But she has no instruments for this. She's in the hands of the regions. And so far, I think it's only a third of these 100,000 that has been tested. And the same is with the instructions to the local authorities for how personnel should behave in elderly care. They actually do not have instruments to force them to do what they are supposed to do. And here I think it's an interesting legal problem that people actually die from this. They have very, very few, if any, legal rights to claim any type of justice or security for them. If you work in the public sector, you have, but as a citizen or a client, it's taken for granted that your interests and the local authorities' interests here are aligned, but they are not, because this is a question about money, of course. But I'm so surprised that they seem to lack instrument for actually enforcing what they believe would be the right policy. So the head of our now famous public health authority said, oh, we said a lot that they should protect the elderly, but they didn't come out with any precise instructions or regulations for how this should be done. So this is a little like a general who said, yeah, we should really fight the enemy, but I'm not sending any ammunition, I'm not sending any marching orders, and I'm not sending any equipment. Just the hope that they would do what he wanted to do. And again, this was known very early on, but I think the main problem here is this very, very powerful association of local authorities and regions who functions like a lobby group. But the problem with them is that accountability doesn't work. You cannot vote the politicians out of office because they are indirectly appointed, and their personnel who work there, they do not work under the regulations as other as people do in the civil service, because they are technically not civil servants. So there is no way to demand accountability. So this is more than a crisis of people dying. This is actually a crisis of the Swedish democratic model.
Thanks very much, Bo. And now Christine, with also a human rights perspective on this. There's also some questions in the chat to the panelists on Finland, on Sweden, and also Norway. But first, Christine, and then I'll also bring in Halvor.
Yeah, thank you. You know, part of when this project Nordic Branding started, one of the sort of lines of inquiry has been human rights, and human rights is something, cultures of human rights, et cetera, and so forth, is something that these countries are all branding themselves as exporters of. And I think my I'm going to say now is partly something because I'm puzzled, and partly as a self-criticism directed at all of us, I guess. So I haven't found in any country a very strong rights-based critique of what's going on. So we did a small piece, or actually I'm not going to take the honor for this, Professor Anne Hellum. She used the right to health to criticize migrant communities' right to health information at the start of the outbreak. I was looking through Swedish newspapers and NGOs yesterday, and I found lots and lots of stuff from Amnesty Sweden and Human Rights Watch Sweden about human rights being violated anywhere else than Sweden. And from Norwegian academics, I mean, frankly, we haven't done anything in terms of mobilizing rights language, for example, with respect to children's rights and children in institutions, people being locked up, people being denied the right to movement. I mean, the only rights-based language has been used to describe the plight of people not going to their summer houses. And I have to say, we in Norway, we've had this COVID tracing app, Smittestopp, which I've been working on for a while now. In Denmark and Sweden, it's been less controversial and I think less of a thing. In Norway, it's been very high profile. The government has told the population that if you want your freedom back, you have to download this app. The human rights community has either been completely quiet and in the main daily tabloid saying a human rights yes to the COVID tracing app. Amnesty said officially, compared to what's going on everywhere else, this is just a mild breeze. And I have to say, I'm very disappointed about Norwegian human rights academics not saying anything about this app, for example. I mean, the good thing in Norway is that we've had a very vibrant constituency of tech people and data protection activists who come together to work on the app and to be critical. But from the human rights community, institutionally and in the NGO sector, pretty disappointing.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to also give Halvor the word to ask a question, and then I'm going to ask the panelists if they want to respond to that question and some other questions which are on the chat at the moment. Halvor.
That's a very interesting discussion. I would ask Bo Rothstein about this. He has this argument that elderly care is the key. And I think that's a very good point. And I think we probably have problems in all the countries with this. So that's something to look into, whether there is something, how specific Sweden is in this case. But wouldn't it be the case that if Sweden had a much stricter line, this would also mobilize healthcare more? And also, I'm not quite sure about what kind of the other countries, at least Norway and Denmark, have introduced state of emergency laws. Did Sweden do that? And couldn't the state of emergency laws actually change this thing? You can't. You could not then explain this by the political system in Sweden because it was a state of emergency. And I also noticed, also to Bo Rothstein, you wrote early on, already in the late March, you wrote an article in international media that trust was the key in order to understand this epidemic. Of course, we have the same trust level in the Nordic countries. But how do you see this? It seems to me that if you look at this internationally, that there are it's hard to see that there is a clear relationship between trust and how this has turned out. And certainly not in the Nordic countries, because Sweden have the same trust level as the other Nordic countries. Thank you.
So I'll give the word to Bo Rothstein. There's a few questions on Sweden, and then to Bo Lidegaard and to Johan Strang.
Yeah, as I said in the beginning, I think leaving everything to the expert civil servants is quite unique. And I think that there is nothing in the Swedish constitution that had hindered the Swedish government to take a command here. I mean, Finland and Sweden has about the same type of relation between the cabinet and these public authorities. And in Finland, the Finnish government acted much more vigorously than in Sweden, and there was nothing that would hinder them. Now, we only have emergency laws when there is a war, and this may have been a problem. But for example, if the national authorities would have issued very strict recommendations for how people working in elderly care should have been protected and how they should operate it, and also about this sickness insurance thing, I'm pretty sure that the local authorities and also the private producers of elderly care would have obeyed, because they would otherwise would have feared that they would have been sued because their personnel, not their clients, but the personnel could have been or had been in danger. So they could have done much more here. What I think this human rights thing that Kristen brought up is important, but I would like to point out that there is one more, and I'm basically I call myself a public administration scholar masquerading as a political scientist. So I'm very interested in what goes on and the nitty-gritty details of the state here. And what you see here is an example of a term I coined more than 20 years ago. It's a kind of black hole in the democracy. So at elderly people who are taken into elderly care, a lot of basically power is wielded over them. Sometimes it can have as now detrimental effects, but there is no one to be held accountable. And this is, I think this is the big human rights problem here, that power is wielded over very frail and elderly people. They are not giving the protection they should have. They are not given the care they should have, and nobody will be held accountable. I have asked for a crisis commission in Swedish, and haverikommission for this. About the trust thing, I wrote this in the beginning of this, and I now have to say it doesn't work as Halvor. It's my thought was that if there would be a lot of regulations in a high trust society where people trust the government more, they would be more willing to obey these regulations than in other countries. But if you look at the outcomes, it hasn't had the effect I supposed to. For example, southern Italy has hardly been affected at all. There are very, very few people who have, the mortality rate is very low compared to northern Italy. But we all know that southern Italy is characterized by extremely low trust, both between people and between people and government. So basically my theory then didn't work. That happens.
Interesting acknowledgements. Bo Lidegaard.
Yes, I'd also like to comment a bit on these terms. First of all, there have been no emergency laws passed in Denmark, but we have had a series of very far-reaching laws passed in a matter of hours, supported by all members of the Folketing, and wielding on specific ministers administrative powers that would normally be completely inconceivable in our democracy. But in my view, that is absolutely not a human rights issue, for example, to prohibit assembly of certain orders of magnitude, things that, of course, under normal conditions, is absolutely a key to a democracy because of the emergency. And actually, I've been arguing also in public here, because there was a debate about this, that in my perception of a well-functioning democracy, it does include the ability to take extreme measures in an extreme case. But of course, it is also part of the democracy that they can only do so under responsibility to the parliaments. And once it's over, of course, everything will be scrutinized and there will be accountability. And at the end of the day, the electorate will judge whether the government and the ministers in exercising these extraordinary powers exceeded what we find is reasonable. And throughout, of course, the debate has been ongoing on social media and digitally, but I don't see a human rights problem there. There we see more where Bo is seeing it in terms of the most vulnerable and their rights to protection. Then on the trust issue, and it does address a little bit also some of the things that Bo said had failed in Sweden. In our experience in Denmark, there was very little authority in terms of forcing a certain behavior. There was a very, very effective campaigning, and there was very, very explicit explanations. You have to wash your hands, you have to do this, you have to keep your distance, you have to do these simple things. And this was communicated, I mean, massively around the clock, all media, all people of authority, very explicitly to personnel in institutions. And it was not that the government was enforcing it in the way of sort of having a legalistic approach to it, but it simply became socially completely unacceptable to deviate from these behaviors that were very simple and very visible. So there was an almost 100% compliance when the lockdown was biggest. We could all leave our houses, we could move around, we could do a lot of things. But in terms of social distancing and personal hygiene, there was a very, very strong trust in society that you did it, I did it, and everyone else would do it too. And of course, to trust is an aspect of social control. And I was actually astonished by the degree of social control in the Danish society, which normally is pretty anti-authoritarian. And basically Danes like to do exactly as we please. But in this particular case, the discipline was there, and it was not the government enforcing it, it was the public, because the rules were so simple and people were sort of disciplined by each other to actually abide by the rules, including the personnel in the healthcare and the elderly care.
Thanks, Bo. And I'll give the word to Johan to answer some a question there if he wants, but also perhaps give his concluding comment, and then Christine, and then the two Bulls, and we'll conclude.
Okay, good. Good that you gave me that hands up. No, first I'd like to press Bo Rothstein on speculating a bit further on why Löfven has been able to hide behind Anders Tegnell. I mean, I talked about the administrative cultures. You talked about, and then there's this emergency law act that there isn't in peacetime, and then you talked about like this watering down of power and authority between districts and so forth. That is really interesting. But is there also something about like the precarious political situation? It's a very weak government with a troublesome deal with the liberals in the center. Then I would like to say, and this would perhaps be my final comment about then the human rights stuff. And I guess it depends upon what you mean with human rights. But in Finland, Martin Scheinin one of our most famous human rights scholars, have been pretty active in criticizing government measures from a constitutional point of view, the border controls between Uusimaa and the rest of Finland and so forth. And wasn't there also a rather hefty debate in Norway as well about the constitutional legitimation of the emergency laws and so forth? In Sweden, perhaps not so much, but then I think that the rights-based argumentation is rather alien to Swedish social democratic political culture, where politics has traditionally been about negotiation, about compromise, rather than about the implementation, about some fundamentalist version of the universal good. So also Bo Rothstein talked about political accountability and not about rights. There was this interesting episode in a semi-comedic podcast of Aftonbladet where they discussed whether the Swedish approach to the pandemic could be seen as a continuation of the Swedish tradition of social engineering, where individuals are sacrificed for the common good, forced sterilization, and these kinds of issues. And they cited foreign media where Tegnell was compared to Eichmann and these kinds of issues. So it was pretty interesting, but unfortunately the hosts lost themselves in some anti-Semitic comments, which perhaps just goes to underline the lack of human rights discourse in Sweden. In general, though, from a Nordic perspective, it seems to me that the discussion has been more about economic equality than human rights when it comes to the pandemic. And perhaps this is a sign of the end of an era, the end of history, the end of the neoliberal era, or something like that. Or then it's just my Twitter feed. I don't know.
Thanks, Johan. A concluding comment from Christine Sandvik.
Thank you. I don't think we can take it for granted that evaluations will distribute responsibility and assigned liability and responsibility. I think we need to be extremely critical as academics to the process that's going to happen now. And I think there are very vested interests involved in making sure that evaluations will come out with a smiley face. I also do think that if we are ever going to be credible actors, we need to use a human rights-based approach at home as well. And for example, what does it mean to be a citizen who's 75 years old in a Nordic country now? What kind of rights do you have? What's the medborgerskap? And I think law can actually be quite handy in putting that on the stage and having the argument played out. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Bo Lidegaard.
Yes, I do think that we will have a very lively political debate. And there is, I guess, no deeper truth in a case like this. If you react to something that is unknown and frightening, you have so perhaps beyond what turns out to be necessary. And the balance between these things eventually is a political balance and political question. And we will differ in our approach, both by country and by individuals. And I don't think we should see this as something that can be passed definitively on a legal basis or judged on a legal basis. This is ultimately political issues, and we should have no problem with not agreeing on them, because that's what the democracy is all about.
Thanks very much, Bo. And the last word from the panelists from the other Bo in Sweden.
Thank you to Johan. Yeah, I have no clear explanation for why our Prime Minister have been so invisible and not being willing to take command in this issue. We shouldn't, it can be very idiosyncratic, personalistic things, I don't know, but it's other crisis. This crisis is very different, because then the Prime Minister and his entourage has really taken the command. Why now? It could be that epidemiology is a more complicated thing for them to intervene than military and foreign policy or economic crisis. Epidemiologists come with their extremely complicated models, mathematical models. I call them toy models. They are based on make-believe data, and they have turned out to be very wrong, but it's very difficult for a layman politician to go in there and argue. Maybe that could be one thing, but it's too early to speculate about it. I think that there will be a commission in Sweden trying to figure out responsibility here after the crisis. That is what has been promised. About going back to the social engineering first, I think the influence of the social engineers has been utterly overrated. They didn't play this big role in actual policies as has been portrayed. And secondly, I don't think there was horrible mistakes in all countries when it comes to forced sterilization and so I don't think Sweden stands out there. So I don't think this goes back to some willingness to sacrifice people for, especially not elderly and frail people. Also, the head of the Population Health Authority, Tegnell, says, now this is horrible, this is terrible what has happened. So it's not that they are defending in any way what has happened. I think this simply shows that if you decentralize responsibility, but you do not decentralize possibility to hold the responsible people accountable, you will end up in big trouble, because the people who are actually responsible is the people running this, I repeat myself, this association for regions and the local authorities. And they cannot be held accountable. Neither the civil servants there or the people who work there, they are actually not civil servants, nor the politicians. So it looks like, you decentralize a lot, but what has happened is that this organization has centralized policy making without accountability. They are the ones who decide, the local authorities in the regions they follow, but no one can hold them accountable for their decisions, or their, in this case, utterly lack of non-decisions.
Thanks very much to the panel. And I think we've got greater clarity on perhaps why Sweden has excess mortality. Perhaps it's the black hole that Bo has described in the Swedish health system. Whether we can explain the different regulatory responses, that still seems to be a mystery. We have the clear reasons given by Johan, but also the puzzlement expressed by other members of the panel as this being somehow exceptional. But the debate will continue. We'd also hope to discuss what are the consequences for the idea of the Nordic model, but that'll have to be our next webinar, so stay tuned for an advertisement on that. And I'll give the word to Tora to close up proceedings.
Well, I'd just like to extend a very warm thank you to the panelists. And I think you've thrown up a lot of perspectives that and some of them that we hadn't thought of. And I'm afraid we haven't been able to respond to all the questions from participants. I have questions I would have liked to ask. So I think the conclusion is that we need to try to continue this conversation, basically. And we'll see whether that will be possible in the nearish future, and that maybe then we'll be able to come to the consequences as well. But thank you so much, and thank you all for participating.
People are welcome to email me if they have questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Pleasure.
Thank you.